This is a text that's a little unusual for me. I'm actually looking at the Philippians text this week. An unusual kind of conversation has been rolling in my mind as to the idea and the understanding, and also a call, I think, to hear the words of Paul, especially this week. This text, where Paul goes through the text talking about his lineage, his life, his place in the society and culture, and kind of lifting that up, and he says, if anybody can brag, it's me. I'm really good. He's done everything by the law, the Jewish law. But then he says, and he goes on, and he says, it's not because I'm perfect, it's not because I've done everything just right, but it's really when I lay that aside and pick up the rest of my life, the fact that he's come to Christ, that he's had an experience with Christ, and that Christ is alive in his life, transitions who Paul is and how Paul sees himself. And this text, this writing to the Philippians, is to remind them of this very text. From what scholars say and understand, as best I understand it, that this time the Philippians had gotten to the point where their lineage and what they did as far as the Jewish law became one of the most important things that was going on. They said that people who were coming to faith and beginning to follow the way of Christ would first have to be raised and understood and taught in the Jewish tradition, and then later they could become Christians. Paul's reminding them that that's not exactly what's going on. Oh, there's a saying that says sometimes people major in the minors. And that's what, for Paul, this text is saying. That these folks have majored in the minors of Scripture faith. And so Paul seeks to remind them that it's not because of their efforts and not because of what they do, but it's because of the very gift of God's grace in their life through Jesus Christ. The purpose was to defend the rights of the Gentiles to be Christians against a large number in the church who assumed that it was necessity to first come a Jew and then to be a Christian. You know, boasting in our birth and in our place in society is not something that is locked away 2,000 years ago in biblical history. It's where we find ourselves in the midst of where we are in our day-to-day living. Sometimes we boast in things that we're good at, an advanced degree, a study that we've done, some effort that we've endeavored to make life better for others, and we see that as a feather in our cap, as we might say. And yet this text reminds us, even in our puffiness, that we still aren't, it's not about us, it's not about the unit, it's not about the individual, but rather the unity of others and believers. It's about unity in our life and in our world, and not the ongoing continuation of division. There is a difference that's made in when we realize that it's not just about us, but it's about God's gift working in and through us, through grace and mercy working in our lives to transform our heart and our eyes and our understanding into the way of God. I always love the way that we begin to talk about that in Methodist theology, with the understanding of grace, of prevenient, justifying and sanctifying grace. That sanctifying grace that comes at the end is not necessarily that we get everything in life perfect. That it says that we're made perfect in this life in love. It doesn't mean that we've achieved something perfect. It means that we continue to work forward, to work on it, to make it happen. Not on our own efforts, but through God's grace, growing and understanding, shaping us in our lives. Teresa of Avila in The Interior Castle put it this way: with the help of divine grace, true union can always be obtained by forcing ourselves to renounce our own will and by following the will of God in all things. Forcing ourselves to renounce our own will and by following the will of God in all things. Our understanding, our life, our effort, what drives us is transformed to be the same thing as drives God. When we continue on in our lives, we realize that, yes, we're not going to get everything perfect. I mean, Paul lays out a good argument at the beginning. He's done everything in life right. Even from a very, very, very early age. But we're not going to get things perfect. One commentator wrote, "The imperfection is the crucible within which the work of God is carried out. The crucible for fire, for purifying gold, is put into the hot oven to be able to burn off all the impurities from the gold to leave with pure gold. But our life is in that same place, with God working in the midst of the fallen world, and our lives with its imperfection. And yet somehow God brings about a new creation for us. The old does not take root. The waters of baptism, the strength of God's grace, the effort, prayer, understanding, continuing with God to transform us to be better people, to be truly who God has created us to be. Oftentimes it's hard to move beyond ourselves. It's pretty easy. We get up in the morning, go to the restroom, look in the mirror, and with our hair all disheveled, wonder how in the world we're ever going to look decent and presentable to the world. And yet, with a hot shower and a little bit of time, we go forth into the world, perhaps just with a little bit of armor that we feel good about ourselves as we go out into the world. We're able to do that, and in the process of that, it's what we project to the world. But yet, oftentimes, we probably should have spent more time in our prayer than we were getting ourselves ready on the outside. For the inside of our lives is what makes a difference for how we treat others and how we go about our day-to-day living. But over and over throughout this text is the idea and the understanding of the unity of the collective. That it's not just about our individuals and following individual laws, but it's about the idea and the understanding that we together live in unity. Perhaps a trite example would be an intersection, much like Spring Garden and Tate. If I pull up into that intersection and I observe the red light and I stop in traffic, and the person who comes along behind me does not, there's a huge bang just outside the preacher's office window. I've heard it more than once since I've been here. But the collective and the good begins to understand that one stops, the other stops. And just as much, if the light turns green and I don't go if I'm sitting at the intersection first, but the car behind me does, there's another bang. Sometimes we don't get to move in an order. I mean, I remember from one of the few things I remember from marching band is the idea that we have to step off at the same time. And that we have to use the same foot. Everybody's moving right, left. I still don't know the difference sometimes. But when we get to a curve, when we get to a bend, a place when, especially this was always that time in parades that I loathed going to. But when we got to a curve, when we went through an intersection as a marching band, we all had to adjust just a little bit to compensate for the others. Those on the far end of this way, on my left, had to step shorter if they were making a left turn, and those on the right, on the far side, would have to step harder. But yet at the same time, once we began to move around the curve, we would reassemble and begin to pull on as a band together. I think that's what Paul's saying here. Yeah, we can get things perfect on our own. But together there's a unity that begins strength, greater and greater and greater. International conversations, it's pretty easy these days to hear some politicians, some leaders tell how important they as an individual are. And yet as a country, I am reminded and I continue to think of us pulling together through great times of trial and tribulation, much like we're experiencing now at the onset of Corona. But together we work, we care one for another. We do wait further apart. We do wash our hands. We do wear our masks, not out of individualism, but because that we care one for another. From what I gather in the studies, the mask is more important to help us be preventing spreading the disease than it is to protect us from the disease, although it helps there too. But we care one for another, laying down the discomfort and the aggravation because we care one for another. That's part of what Christianity does. This week is World Communion Sunday. What a weird way to celebrate World Communion. We're not having communion here, partly because it wouldn't be the same. One, there's so many of our congregation and family and friends missing. And the other side of it is, by the time we made it look like an operating room and here to have bread and juice, I think it would lose the point. But part of what we do generally at World Communion is to be reminded that we celebrate communion, that we celebrate and live out our faith, not only with the people who sit next to us or who live in our house or in our neighborhood, but with people all around the world. That the unifying factor of Christ reminds us that we together are brothers and sisters. That the waters of baptism remind us that we don't have last names, we have Christian names. Have been given and help us recognize one another. And the grace that continues to be given through communion is a reminder of Christ's presence with us. In the communion liturgy, we always say, "Do this in remembrance of me." The Greek word there is anamnesis. And anamnesis actually has a threefold meaning that we often forget, and we're sometimes limited by our English language where the Greek can carry it. Do this in remembrance of me means to remember what God has done long, long ago for us in our world. That God created us. God heard pleas and cries from those who were in bondage in Egypt, who led them to freedom across the river, the Red Sea. That God enabled them to go into the land of Canaan and began to bless them, that they were able to grow and to be nurtured. That in the fullness of time, God sent Jesus through Mary in the stable to be able to come and show us fullness who God is. And we remember the work of the cross, the forgiveness that's offered through its work, and the death of Christ. But we also remember in that the resurrection and the promise of God being alive forevermore. The early disciples, when they broke bread together around the table, first with the resurrected Christ, they saw the fullness of Him. We're asked to remember all that. We're asked to remember that God, through Jesus, promises to be with us always, never to leave us or forsake us. And they were also asked to this do in remembrance of me, to remember the promise of the second coming, the promise of the resurrection for each of us, the promise of the goodness of God revealed on the earth, and the new heaven and the new earth revealed for us, that God's kingdom can unfold. Paul's on to something. Paul's on to us remembering the grace of Christ at work in us. Not through our own efforts, but through God's grace alone. Will the world and each of us be transformed into the goodness of God as God created us to be. All glory, honor, and peace be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.